In 1947, a Stern Gang member and a brilliant bomb maker, Yakov Levstein, who had been based in France and been released from a Belgian prison after a failed bomb attempt in London, was rearrested when he crossed back into France. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. "I know all about you," said the local police chief. "Tell me, entre nous, did you really try to kill Englishmen?" Levstein tried to deny his connection to the Stern Gang, but was stopped by the flic. "One should kill the British wherever one can find them. They are pathological liars, and this is how they rule the whole world. I saw it myself. I served in Lebanon and Syria in de Gaulle's Free France army. We spilled our blood helping the British in the Levant, and after they took over Lebanon and Syria, they threw us to the dogs." And with that, he produced a bottle of wine and poured Levstein and himself a drink. We could put down this attitude of a provincial gendarme to the parochial xenophobia of a petit fonctionnaire. But this French suspicion and hatred of the British, and vice versa, permeated Anglo-French relations at top levels of both governments, foreign policy and colonial administration during the 30-odd years starting in 1915. We are surely all aware of the centuries of rivalry between France and Britain, from the 100 Years' War of the Middle Ages to de Gaulle's refusal to let Britain join the common market. The web of intrigue and deceit that marked their dealings in the Middle East, however, makes for an interesting but very shabby story. Britain and France carved up the Middle East portion of the defunct Ottoman Empire after World War I, with France getting Syria, which included Lebanon, and Britain Mesopotamia, renamed Iraq. Palestine would come under international control. Having cooperated in the divvying up of the spoils, Britain reluctantly accepted the presence of the French in the Middle East as what the ambassador to Cairo, Lord Killearn, called a necessary evil, a perpetual irritant which upsets British policy in the Middle East. As the build-up of another war with Germany progressed from possible to likely and then to inevitable, keeping in with France as an ally was more important than pursuing supremacy in the Middle East. The collapse of France in 1940, however, put an end to this policy. No longer would France, under the collaborative Vichy government, be an ally in the conflict with Germany, and the two uneasy bedfellows spent the war years in wrangling and intrigue. This included the sponsoring, financing, and implementing of terrorism on both sides. In November 1915, Britain and France tried to resolve tensions caused by their rival ambitions in the region. In a secret agreement, even though the outcome of the war was not certain, a partition was proposed at a meeting of Asquith's War Cabinet by Sir Mark Sykes, a member of Parliament, a flamboyant, self-proclaimed Middle East expert, who took a pencil and slashed it across the map, from the E in Acre to the final K in Kirkuk. North of the line, excluding Haifa but keeping Mosul, would be under French protection. South of the line would be British. After much negotiating, in May 1916, Monsieur François Sykes-Picot agreed on behalf of the French. No one should have been surprised that a secret agreement between two imperial powers was reached. In the previous century, imperialist aggrandizement was normal. The worst exploitative colonial regime being that of the Belgians, where under King Leopold more than 2 million Congolese were killed. By the time the Sykes-Picot Agreement was signed, crude and genocidal land grabbing was no longer acceptable. Chief critic of the system was American President Woodrow Wilson, who, when the US entered the war in 1917, declared that European imperialism was unacceptable and that when the war was over, subject and stateless peoples should be able to choose their own destinies, the doctrine of self-determination. Dismayed at not having got Palestine as a buffer to protect the all-important Suez Canal, Britain decided to court the Zionists, urged on by Jewish cabinet minister Herbert Samuel. There were two good reasons, he argued, for supporting a Jewish colony east of Suez. Britain could deny the territory to foreign powers who might threaten the canal, and winning the support of 2 million Jews in America might bring the US into the war. Succeeding Asquith at the end of 1916, by April 1917, Lloyd George decided to invade Palestine. Well aware that such a move would spark accusations of imperialism, he decided that support for stateless Zionists was a good way to thwart French ambitions in the Middle East and silence Wilson at the same time. Not, as Asquith said, that he, Lloyd George, gives a damn about the Jews, or their past, or their future, but because he doesn't want to let the Christian holy places to fall into the hands of the agnostic, atheistic French. Chaim Weizmann assured the PM of Zionist support for Britain's endeavor. Lloyd George instructed Sykes, who was on his way to Egypt with Picot to deal with any questions that the proposed invasion of Palestine would raise, on the importance of the Jews as being of more help than the Arabs, and that there should be no political pledges to the Arabs, particularly none in regard to Palestine. Sir Henry McMahon, however, governor of Egypt, made promises of autonomy to Hussein, albeit hazily worded, that would cause endless repercussion. The French reaction was to refuse to believe that anyone could be so stupid as to pursue a policy that was bound to create trouble between the Arabs and the Jews. When Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour revealed the Sykes-Picot agreement to President Wilson's foreign policy advisor Edward House, House was furious. It's all bad. They're making it a breeding place for future war. The Sykes-Picot agreement was an academic exercise as far as the British were concerned. As they hoped, and the French feared, reality on the ground swiftly made the pact irrelevant. Sharif Hussein of Mecca's revolt against the Turks in June 1916 was just such a fact on the ground, and seen by France as a threat, and by Britain as an opportunity. The threat was that if successful, Hussein would wield influence over France's Muslim North African colonies, and more worryingly, the Arab partisans seeking a greater Arab kingdom would try to expand into Syria and Iraq, from which the French and the British would have to expel them. Britain's opportunity in the Arab revolt was to use Hussein's son, Prince Faisal, aided by British arms and that much romanticized military advisor, T.E. Lawrence, to connect with the underground Arab nationalist movement in the cities of Syria and Iraq. Excessive Arab squabbling, however, made the ousting of the French unattainable. Lawrence, learning of the official British leaning towards the Zionists to help them tighten their grip on the Middle East, asked Sykes to clarify the inconsistencies in the British promises, first to the Arabs, then to the French, and now to the Jews. "We are in rather a hole," he concluded. "Please tell me what, in your opinion, are the actual means by which we will find a way out." And we're still looking for it, aren't we? In 1917, General Allenby finally wrenched Palestine from the Turks in fulfillment of the strategy essential to keep the French from pressing for the agreed international administration of Palestine. With the conquest of Palestine, the British government made its support for Zionism public. On the 7th of November, the Times published a letter from Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild. "I have much pleasure in conveying to you the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet." And then we have the Balfour Declaration. The San Remo Conference in April 1920 confirmed the French mandate in Syria and Lebanon, with the French taking control of Damascus the following month as per the mandate, and British control over Mesopotamia and Palestine confirmed, but all under the League of Nations. The wording of the agreement made it clear that the chief responsibility of the mandatory powers was to prepare their territories for independence, and in this they both failed abysmally. The vital importance of British Palestine in protecting Egypt was matched by its strategic location with regard to oil. As early as 1918, a senior admiral drew Lloyd George's attention to the fact that Britain must have oil. 4 times more efficient than coal, it would take over as the major marine fuel. Britain was vulnerable as she depended on the US for oil. Clearly, if GB were to remain the dominant maritime power, she needed undisputed control of the greatest amount of petroleum we can. Before the war, German geologists had reported the area around Mosul as housing the largest undeveloped resources at present known in the world. The power that controls the oil lands of Persia and Mesopotamia will control the supply of the majority of the liquid fuel of the future. To this end, when Clemenceau asked Lloyd George what he wanted in a private meeting before the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, Lloyd George replied, "I want Mosul." "You should have it. Anything else?" "Yes, I want Jerusalem too. You shall have it." Things weren't so friendly when it actually came to the peace conference. France demanded and received an equal share of the Mesopotamian oil, while Britain insisted on Palmyra, which is so much in the news as being destroyed today, which is just shocking. Halfway between Damascus and the Euphrates, and a vital station for an oil pipeline from Mosul to the Med. This would dramatically reduce the territory that France claimed as Syria. The British really pulled a fast one here, you see. Clemenceau accused Lloyd George, "From the very first day after the Armistice, I found you an enemy of France." "Well," joked Lloyd George, "was it not always our traditional policy?" Ho, ho, ho. Clemenceau didn't see the joke. It was obvious that the wartime allies were rivals once again. Oil was eventually struck in October 1927 near Kirkuk. By 1934, after much dispute over the route, a pipeline was completed that bifurcated, one branch going to Aleppo for the French and the other reaching the sea at Haifa for the British. By 1940, the Iraqi oil fields were producing 4 million tons a year and the full requirements of the British Mediterranean fleet. The pipeline was the carotid artery of the British Empire. Palestine's new strategic importance as the outlet of Iraqi oil made the British determined to hang on at any cost, despite mounting opposition to their fulfillment of their mandate. From the start, the British were convinced that the French were stirring up trouble in Palestine. Chaim Weizmann claimed that Arab hostility to the Jews was artificial. And when demonstrations took place in Jerusalem in 1920 in favor of the unification of Palestine with Syria under Arab control, Chief Political Officer Richard Meinertzhagen wrote, "They were certainly the result of French efforts to destabilize British rule." Over the next few years, Britain had to deal not only with sporadic violence in Palestine, but also with revolts in Iraq. And they were also under continuous pressure from both public and Parliament to cut the enormous costs of running the mandate. At one point, they had 300,000 troops in the area. To reduce these problems, Faisal was installed as King of Iraq in 1921, Mesopotamia renamed Iraq, and his brother Abdullah in Transjordan as King of the new Kingdom of Jordan, created as a safety valve to restrain Arab opposition to the Jews across the river. The French too had their difficulties in administering their mandate, with a prolonged revolt by the Druze that only ended in 1927 with the help of the British. Although Gamelin, the French commander-in-chief, praised the British for their help, many French intelligence officers were convinced the British had done their utmost to prolong the revolt in an attempt to force the French out of Syria. Jewish immigration after the Balfour Declaration had not been a political issue, as numbers weren't high in the 1920s, but tougher immigration policies by the US and other Western countries led to increased Jewish desire to enter Palestine. After Hitler's seizure of power in 1933, numbers really jumped. From 9,500 in the year 1932 to 60,000 in 1935. Resulting tensions led to riots in Jerusalem, Hebron, Sfat, and other places with considerable loss of life. In 1936, a royal commission led by Lord Peel arrived to look into the Arabs' grievances. They quickly decided that the conflict between Arab and Jew were irrepressible and recommended partition. The commission only made Britain's political situation worse, for the report got out to the public with its attached map, and the map was really the problem, because it showed clearly that it allocated much of northern and coastal Palestine, along with its Arab population, to the Jews. The Arabs were incandescent and, confident from the poor handling of the violence in 1936, rejected the proposal and renewed bloody protests. Mohammed Amin al-Husseini, the charismatic Mufti of Jerusalem, who was also head of the Arab Higher Council, with whom the British had had good relations, lost British sympathy when Lewis Andrews, the assistant district commissioner in northern Palestine, was murdered along with his bodyguard. This was the turning point in the British government's approach. 3 days after the murders, they outlawed the Arab Higher Committee and arrested its members, but al-Husseini escaped, disguised as a woman. His appearance 3 weeks later in Lebanon was conclusive proof that the Arabs were now using Syria and Lebanon as a safe base. The French did little to help in bringing gangs who sought sanctuary and support across the border to justice. So eventually 2 new measures were brought in. A 50-mile-long fence along the border with Syria and Lebanon to be patrolled by the Palestine police, and the enlisting of much more ruthless men in the police force. There was, according to a former serving policeman, definitely a touch of the black and tans method about the police. The brutal and indiscriminate approach, collective punishment, burning and bulldozing of houses, cordon and search operations, all led in a vicious circle and turned what had been disorganized banditry into a general insurgency. Up until 1938, the Yeshuv, the Jewish community, had followed a policy of self-restraint, or havgalah. But after the hanging of Shlomo Youssef in June 1938 for shooting at an Arab bus, even though there were no casualties, havgalah ceased. The execution triggered a wave of revenge attacks, and the escalating tit-for-tat left Britain in an impossible situation, for even moderate Arabs refused to negotiate with the British for fear of being murdered by their own people. Britain's abrupt changes of policy and their refusal to establish meaningful representative government made it clear to those they ruled, both Arab and Jew, that violence worked. And this was true for the French as well in Syria. They suffered the same problem. At this time, with war imminent, fear about the Arabs' numerical strength outweighed concerns about the Jews' political influence in the US. The Suez Canal and the uninterrupted flow of oil from Iraq were far more important than a commitment made 22 years before by a man now 10 years dead, Balfour. Also, the 20,000 frontline troops used during the insurgency were needed elsewhere. Jewish immigration was further restricted, and as Balfour had similarly said 20 years earlier with regard to the French and the Arabs, Chamberlain now said, if we must offend one side, let us offend the Jews. The arrival of General de Gaulle to establish Free France in London in June 1940 certainly didn't improve Anglo-French relations. Central to his envisaged fight back was the vast French Empire with the Levant at the heart of the strategy and the help of the British essential. But cooperation was barely sustainable in an atmosphere of suspicion and distrust. At the center of the conflict of interests was the British plan for a Greater Syria, that is, a confederation of Arab states free from French influence. The French would have to go. Cooperation between the Free French and the Zionist resistant movement went back to September 1940, when David Hakon, whose construction company had built the fence, agreed to house 3 Free French activists in his home. He allowed them to set up a secret radio transmitter in his house to broadcast propaganda into Syria, the British having refused to let the Free French do so openly. The Jewish Agency explained, "The Free French will be important in the France of tomorrow, and we hope they won't forget the sympathy shown them by Jewish Jerusalem." The relationship between the Free French and the Zionists thrived as Jewish anger grew over their treatment by the British. The Free French had already received help from the Haganah, who provided guides from their elite commando unit, the Palmach, to aid the Free French invasion of the Levant in 1941. And Moshe Dayan was a member of the little group that went to act as guides, and he said they hadn't a clue where they were going, so they had to get an Arab to help show the way. Abraham Stern, an Irgun leader, had fallen out with the group over their early collaboration with the British. Stern felt that the Jews should help the British war effort only after receiving independence. When this clearly was not happening, he sent a message via Vichy France to Hitler, offering to fight for Germany if Hitler would support the re-establishment of the Jewish state in its historic borders, allied to the German Reich. Not having received a reply, and fed up after the tragic loss of the Patria and the Struma, Stern launched a campaign of violence at the start of 1942. Stern was betrayed, murdered, and most of his gang rounded up by the Palestine police. Most, but not all. "My God," exclaimed Palestine Police CID Chief Arthur Giles. "My God, these French are the bloody limit. Do you know what they're up to?" CID detectives had received a tip-off that a taxi carrying 3 Stern gang members had left Jerusalem traveling north. The detectives caught up with the taxi at Tiberias and followed it to the Lebanon border. The 3 Jews alighted and were warmly welcomed into Lebanon by a French officer. Lots of kissing and welcoming. The Stern gang took a new lease of life in November 1943 when 20 members tunneled out of a prison camp at Latrun. But their problem remained the same: finance and arms. As Yitzhak Shamir recalled, the bank robberies and break-ins necessary to meet these needs was losing the gang's support and added to public indignation. The solution: appeal to the French. Years later, a Stern gang member confirmed that the Vichy administration in Beirut had gladly supplied us with arms of all kinds, knowing they were intended to attack their British enemy. Immediately after the war, Clement Attlee's Labour government declared that it was morally wrong and politically indefensible to impose obstacles to the entry of Palestine to any Jew who desires to go there. But this sympathy didn't last. Ernest Bevin, the new Foreign Secretary, said to Attlee, "Clem, The lads in the office, meaning the Foreign Office, about Palestine. According to them, we've got it wrong. We have to think again. On the other hand, in the US, Truman's support for lifting restrictions on Jewish immigration into Palestine was even more of an electoral necessity. "I am sorry, gentlemen," he told a group of Arab businessmen who came to complain about his bias, "but I have to answer to hundreds of thousands who are anxious. Best of Zionism. I do not have hundreds of thousands of Arabs among my constituents. British refusal to increase immigration quotas fueled more Arab-Jewish violence. Ben-Gurion told the Haganah leader Moshe Sneh to start cooperating with the Irgun and the Stern Gang as a combined Jewish movement, sabotaging the railway network, the Haifa oil refinery, bombing police headquarters in Jerusalem, attacking police and military encampments, and destroying on the ground 12 British aircraft. The list goes on. By the end of 1945, Britain had established that the Jewish Agency, intended at its inception in 1929 to be a subordinate and advisory body, was operating as a parallel government to the British administration and actively colluding with the terrorists. The British decided to raid the Jerusalem headquarters of the Jewish Agency, hoping to find documentary evidence incriminating both the Jewish Agency and, most importantly, the French. The ensuing raid collected 3 truckloads of papers and detained, eventually, a total of 2,718 people, but yielded nothing truly damning. A sympathetic British officer had tipped them off. The only evidence of increasing links between the French and Zionists was a photograph showing Ben-Gurion and Sneh enjoying a cup of coffee in a Paris cafe. The Zionists, however, were unnerved by the scale of the operation, and Menachem Begin was ordered by Sneh to bomb the south wing of the King David Hotel, where the documents would have been taken, as it was the British administration headquarters. International outrage and condemnation convinced Begin and Friedman Yellen of the Stern Gang that Ben-Gurion was going to betray them, as he had, as head of the Jewish Agency, immediately broken off contact with them. And so they looked for support abroad to the US and France. The American League for a Free Palestine was set up in 1944 as the brainchild of a senior member of the Irgun, Hillel Kook, son of the well-known rabbi. His aim was to raise money and also sympathy for the Irgun's violent methods, although the public weren't aware of the identity of the League's founders, by making parallels between the Zionist struggle against the British and the Americans 150 years previously. As a nation born in revolution against the same brand of Britannic despotism, we know that no matter how hard the struggle, it is the Hebrew David that will beat the British Goliath. The American public was already aware that more than a year had passed since Truman's call for the British to let 100,000 Jews into Palestine, without result. Political expediency still motivated Truman, as in New York, where the Jewish vote really did count, Republican Governor Thomas Dewey, running for re-election, supported Jewish immigration. And so, Democrat Truman, on the eve of Yom Kippur, called for the creation of a viable Jewish state. 2 days later, Dewey upped the stakes by demanding that hundreds of thousands be allowed into Palestine. The next year, British Foreign Minister Bevan revealed that the US State Department had told him that the president's statement had been a deliberate attempt to outbid Dewey. The American League had achieved its goal. It had forced the 2 main political parties into a bidding war and created tensions between the US and Britain. The League also set up a branch in Paris, where Cook compared the Irgun struggle with that of the French resistance to elicit sympathy and cash. Whereas in the US, the backing of film stars had been sought. Frank Sinatra and Bob Hope signed up. In France, it was the intellectuals who climbed on the bandwagon, Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, as well as prominent former members of the resistance. And now I have to find page 14. Here it is. France continued to be the safe haven for the Irgun and the launching pad of their attacks on the British, now taken to the homeland. In 1947, a bomb planted in the ladies' lavatory of the colonial officers' headquarters on Whitehall failed to go off. The device was made of French gelignite and was covered in the fingerprints of a man who had escaped from Palestine in 1943. Another pointer to French provenance of the attack was the fact that the young woman who had left the device had spoken to the guard with a French accent. A match for the fingerprints was found, Yakov Levstein, whom we met at the beginning. This concrete evidence corroborated the British government's information that the Jewish operatives were planning to use Paris as a base for assassinations of major British politicians, including Churchill and Bevan. Levstein also organized a successful bombing in Britain, using a Sorbonne student of Sartre's to leave a coat padded with gelignite at the Colonies Club, a social club for servicemen near Trafalgar Square, with considerable casualties. Persuading the French police to crack down on the terrorists was not easy, because the French Minister of the Interior, Edouard Depreux, sympathized with the Zionists and was a great admirer of former French President Léon Blum, who of course was Jewish. Blum blamed the British for provoking terrorism by closing one after the other all the avenues of hope to the Jews of Palestine and the Zionists across the world. So, when a Zionist consignment of arms was impounded by the police in the south of France in 1946, he ordered the release of the weapons and their onward shipment to Palestine. He also influenced the French government's decision to not be too zealous in checking visas of those leaving France. Another Irgun trainer, having recruited, prepared, and dispatched Jews from Italy, moved to Paris to do the same there. One of his recruits, American Rabbi Bernard Korff, moved to Paris to implement his scheme to parachute Jews into Palestine, literally over the heads of the British as they stopped the immigrants' influx by sea. France's Foreign Minister Bidot, however, politely vetoed the idea of reining Jews into the Promised Land. Korff then revised his plan, substituting dropping of propaganda leaflets to be followed by bombs onto London. He hired a pilot and arranged a rendezvous at an aerodrome west of Paris. When he arrived, he was arrested by a squad of 20 policemen dressed as mechanics. The pilot had shot him. Despite scuppering Korff's plan, the French made absolutely no effort to stop mass illegal immigration from French ports in the south of France. Bidot, although obliged to make the officially correct noises of cooperation to the British embassy's protests, actually did nothing to help. A French newspaper reported the following exchange between an aspiring group of émigrés and a policeman. "Where are you going?" the policeman asked. "We are going to Bolivia," the group's leader replied, showing the appropriately stamped collective visa. "A lovely country," the flic remarked. "I know it well. I served 3 years in Syria." By mid-1947, convoys of trucks bearing up to 500 Jews arrived at the ports every other night. There, the refugees were helped by sympathetic officials and a network of dockers, fishermen, and shipping agents. The dreadful episode of the Exodus when, passengers having been deported to Hamburg, where they were forcibly removed by 1,000 British troops, backed up by 1,500 German policemen, using water hoses, truncheons, and tear gas, demonstrated that Britain could no longer rule Palestine. Attlee did not wait for the UN debate on UNSCOP's recommendations that the mandate should end and the country be split between Arabs and Jews, with Jerusalem an international zone. He announced on the 26th of September that Britain would withdraw from Palestine unilaterally on the 14th of May 1948, regardless of the UN's decision. After the establishment of the State of Israel, having voted in favor of partition while the British abstained, and the French vote was very important because the four sort of satellite countries, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Belgium, 3 countries, went along with France, and that made the difference in the vote. The British abstained. The French continued their support in the immediately ensuing war by enabling the Israelis to buy arms from the Czechoslovak government and also borrowing $26 million to equip and arm 8,000 Haganah soldiers. France remained Israel's leading arms supplier until 1956. In the dying days of the mandate in 1947, British public opinion turned venomously against the Zionists and against the Jews generally. Due to the success of Irgun operations, such as the spectacular attack on Acre prison in May, the British cabinet approved the recruitment of special squads, good men for dirty work, and dirty work they did. And the most infamous incident was the kidnapping, torturing, and murder of a 16-year-old youth, Jewish youth from Rahavia, who was putting up posters for the Irgun. And at the scene of his abduction, which was observed by neighbors, was found a grey felt trilby, and inside the hatband was the name Major something or other Farron. And this caused a huge scandal, and he was responsible, and he absconded and he fled the country, and then he came back, and there was a lot of toing and froing. He was eventually tried, and the scandal was he was let off. And of course, now that all these documents are unclassified, we know the real story, that of course he was guilty, and there was a huge cover-up. So a lot of dirty work was done in the dying days of the mandate. Despite calls for clemency, 3 of the Irgun captured after the Acre prison break were hanged. As he had warned the British, Menachem Begin retaliated and hanged 2 British sergeants who had been kidnapped earlier. The press was allowed to photograph the bodies and subsequent gruesome remains after booby traps exploded when the corpses were cut down. Press reports sparked rioting in British towns and cities, and in Liverpool, 300 Jewish properties were attacked. There were no more executions carried out in Palestine. The struggle between Britain and France for the mastery of the Middle East was the last gasp of empire building that created a conflict that is still with us today. British dissatisfaction over the Sykes-Picot deal led to support for Zionist ambitions. And so, the rights of the Jews to a country of their own became dangerously associated with a cynical maneuver designed to outwit the French. The British in Palestine, as did the French with the Christian population in Lebanon, used a commitment to a stateless people to camouflage their land grab and expected gratitude.